So which Warhammer 40K factions perhaps have a reputation for being overcomplicated to play in-game? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about complex armies within Warhammer 40k, go through a few examples of ones that have really quite a lot of mental load attached, and talk about why they might do so. In my experience, I feel that there's 3 of them that maybe stick out just a bit more than most of the rest, but please let me know the armies that you think that are going to be most complex to play down in the video comments. In general, Warhammer 40k 9th edition has generally made the game a bit more complex. 8th edition started by very simplified index rules, then I feel as they've released multiple codexes for 8th edition then 9th edition, plus some supplements along the way, armies have generally acquired multiple layers of special rules, the 9th edition codexes in particular being kind of renowned for all the stacking rules that you can put on the same models in your army. Even the most basic troopers might be affected by multiple layers of special rules all at once. You might have your sub-faction armies like your chapter tactics for your ultramarines to fall back and shoot, army-wide special rules like shock assault or bolter discipline, progressive turn-by-turn rules like the Space Marine combat doctrines to give them extra AP and other special rules in different turns of the game, plus all the things that you get on the board to buff them otherwise, like stratagems to make their guns better, or character auras to make them stronger or tougher, or shoot straighter. Almost every army in the game now can have the majority of these going on, but there's perhaps a few armies that take it to the next level. In this one I thought we'd talk through 3 of the armies that I'd consider some of the most complex to play in Warhammer 40k as it stands at the moment. Not necessarily the hardest if you just want to pick them up and stick to the basics, use the units and not worry too much about synergies and optimization, but if you did want to dig in deep and have your entire army functioning as optimally as possible, there's really quite a lot of moving parts and decision paralysis that you might face as you're commanding them across the table. First up, we've got the machine people of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Certainly since their 9th edition codex came out, they've had a reputation for being the big layered buffs army. The codex really is a complicated one, with lots of units having slightly shifted keywords compared with each other's. And while they do have all of the standard special rules that you might layer on certain units, I feel like they take some areas to an extreme. In particular, AdMech armies at the moment generally tends to have an absolutely huge command phase. Lots of their characters can apply focus buffs to one unit or another, perhaps the most obvious example being all these Skitarii warlord traits that you can broadcast around the table, things like program retreats to fall back and shoot, and having units ignore the heavy weapon movement penalty, or getting light cover. There's also the Skitarii Marshals ignores Doctrine as benefits, which we'll talk about in a second, and Tech Priest focal buffs as well, things like their innate ones like the Manipulus giving extra damage to Vanguard, the Raiment of the Technomartyr to allow better movement while shooting, and the various flavours of Holy Order Warlord trait, many of which can be very meaningful for one unit or another. With such a big command phase in place, it means that you'll usually have a whole load of tokens and markers in play as a result, lots of buffs that you need to hand out to the units, get them on the right ones, and then remember the buffs when they actually come up and they matter in-game. And then you can't really relax from positioning in the movement phase as well. You need to think about where the squads would need to be in the next command phase for any buffs that need to be super close to their own units. It's very easy to have units slightly out of position, like a Tech Priest that can't quite put its buff on the unit that it wants to, because it's too far away. Some of the Skitarii Warlord traits can get around that with the data tether type things, but not every unit has those. Then, as well as all the normal things like the Forge World traits, stratagems, and datasheet type rules, there's also 2 different tables of selectable buffs each turn, the Doctrina Imperatives for the Skitarii, and the Canticles of the Omnissiah that are mainly for the Cult Mechanicus units, but can also apply to Skitarii as well if you're Mars. The Doctrina Imperatives are the ones that allow you to make some really big decisions with the army, things like the Bulwark Doctrine, which gives you +1 to your saves army-wide but slows everyone down. It can make using those into a really quite a big decision, say weighing up whether or not extra army durability is worth one squad not being able to make it to an objective, or maybe needing to gamble on an advance to do so. There's also the decision for what units you might want to save from the debuff from the Skitarii Marshals option, and again that could be a big decision and affect whether or not you want to use the Doctrina in the first place. Then on top of that there's those Canticles of the Omnissiah, another completely independent roster of 6 straight buffs this time that you cycle through over the course of the game. It can give you some really interesting options if you're playing Mars with these. You could be getting double dipping on durability buffs like Shroud's Arm and Bulwark in the same turn if it made sense, or try and mix things up by using some durability or some movement or damage buffs if that made more sense. It does mean that each turn you might have some seriously major decisions to make as to how the army is going to play for the rest of the turn and the rest of the game, and having to weigh up the entire game state and whether or not it's worth putting this buff and debuff on your whole army and whether it's going to be worth it or not, again definitely adds to the mental load. Then when you're playing with the units having potentially both of these rules in effect on Skitarii units already affected by multiple command phase buffs, and you've got quite a lot to remember. Next up, for an army that's pretty much on the complicated side, are the Thousand Sons. Perhaps not too dissimilar to the Admech, they're perhaps an army where it might make sense for them to have overly convoluted schemes, but they certainly seem to have that going on in their codex. Coordinating the psychic phase for them can be a bit of an art, and one that's got a whole load of decisions to make. In general, the Thousand Sons as an army are pretty much reliant on psychic for being strong. They need it for damage dealing, movement and teleportation type things, buffs for their units, plus potentially secondary objectives as well. If you don't use it particularly optimally, then the army is going to be way weaker, but there's usually quite a lot going on with it, with the sorcerers and the bunch of squad psychers as well. It's very easy to have 15 plus cast in a 2000 point list, and some armies will have more. I think the reason that the psychic phase is kind of hard to coordinate is that it's always a bit uncertain. Some powers are probably going to fail, and some are likely to be denied by the enemy if they've got any sort of psychic defense going on. The core mechanic of the army is just a little bit unreliable, and it can just be a little bit uncertain when a key power that you absolutely need to go off might fail, or the opponent denies it with their own psyker or stratagem or something. Each time the psychic fails, your priorities might just shift a little bit as to what you really need to do with the rest of the psychic phase and what you're going to do with the rest of the turn. Because of that, the order that you cast the psychic powers could be important, whether you try and use a few more basic spells to try and bait out enemy denies so you can hit them with the really good stuff, or if you try and get the most important stuff cast first so you can use Kabbalistic rituals and things to make sure they go through, and that might have been a better decision. Talking of which, the Kabbalistic ritual points are another resource that you have to manage while you're going on through the psychic phase. A few of the picks for them are kind of obvious, but basically when you cast, you do have the option of 9 different options to buff or debuff that psychic power, potentially have it cast on a higher result if you need to, throw in a few more mortal wounds or a few other tricks, and then weighing that up against whether or not you need those points later in the turn for other powers. Then you can also manipulate Psychic with the Infernal Master's reroll and the Command Point reroll as well. Both of those just add to the Kabbalistic rituals that you need to manage. And just in general, for unfolding the plan of the army, I'd say that what to teleport is perhaps one of the biggest decisions for the army each turn. The Cult of Duplicity is perhaps the most commonly played Thousand Sons army competitively. That one allows you to basically teleport jump a unit around the board with a Psychic cast, and what you choose to do that with can be really quite a big deal and shift the game in a major way. Then, just to add to uncertainty and a headache, you are doing all these psychic casts to get your units in the right places, and you don't actually know what your shooting phase or your assault damage is going to do. So while you might have set everything up early, the dice gods might still punish you with poor rolls in the later phases. Finally, as if the psychic phase didn't already have enough decisions to make, there's also a stratagem that they can use to swap a spell out for another. It means that each psyker in the army can potentially access all the ones in the codex, and there's often going to be times when just having a key power on a key psyker could actually make a huge difference to the course of the game. So just another thing to have in the back of your mind while you're doing all the psychic casts. Just keep all the powers in the codex in your mind, and whether or not you want to swap out a power for them if it makes more sense. Overall, definitely a lot going on. The schemes of Tzeentch are complex indeed. Finally, for 40k armies that are considered a bit more complicated and harder to play are the Genestealer Cults. I'd say that these guys are perhaps harder to play for a different kind of reason, less sort of mental load compared with the Admech or the Thousand Sons, or at least mental load in a different kind of way, having to commit your units to really quite big hits on the enemy army, and having a force where you really get the option to be in control of the game quite heavily. Loads of nasty tricks to make your units punch up against the enemy, but if you don't manage to use them optimally, you're probably still going to lose. Genestealer Cults definitely seem to be an army that are doing pretty well at the moment, though I would argue that they're still a harder one to master than most. In terms of the types of options that Genestealer Cult players might have on the board, they might be able to gain some positioning advantages using their blip deployments. They might have the option for big first turn charges from Genestealers or playing safe from them. There's multiple different options and ways that they can use things to gain crossfire on the enemy and go for some really big damage dealing there. Sometimes that could be worth sacrificing a unit just literally for the positioning of that, sometimes not. Several of their dangerous melee units can drop at 8 inches away, a charge that's odds on with a command point reroll but still not super reliable there, and that can be a very big play when you do so. Often armies have a unit that can drop just outside of 3 inches away with one of their proficient planning upgrades, That one has a lot of options for shenanigans, such as sneaking away enemy objectives, or getting the jump on a really unexpected part of the opponent's army that they thought should be safe, and then coordinating all of this with the various Genestealer Cult cast of characters. They have rather a large roster of them, all of which do different things. Maybe particularly psychic powers like mass hypnosis could be a big deal when passed or failed. Never mind all the other buffs and things that characters can give the Genestealer units. I think all of this comes together in your opponent just kind of wondering where the Genestealer Cult are going to be fighting next. The Genestealer Cult player is usually going to have the options to put their units where they want and strike at the right part of the opponent army. The enemy army is going to be a bit more reactive on the whole, but it does mean that the cultist force could play very, very differently depending on whether they're playing cagely or going for the throat on certain areas of the board. Which of their assets are worth trading or risking with the enemy army, and which things can they afford to either ignore or keep away from. I think all of this comes against a backdrop of being at least fairly easy to kill if they are exposed on the table. The majority of their units hit pretty hard in combat or at shooting with crossfire, but if the enemy does get to attack them in return, then usually for the points cost that you paid for them, they're going to go down really quite quickly. It means that you can have units of light infantry bringing down something that ordinarily their stats wouldn't allow them to. But then if they do happen to get caught out in the open because they couldn't quite make it to cover, or they didn't quite do enough damage to the enemy unit that they were trying to kill, then they could just get killed trivially easily in return and hand a massive win to your opponent nonetheless. They're perhaps an army where a small mistake is just going to get punished horrendously. Say if your opponent can just sneak into a line of sight on one of your fragile units, then it could be absolutely game changing. Let me know what you think though. Would you agree that these are some of the harder armies to play in Warhammer 40k at the moment? And are there any other armies that you think are particularly challenging to play in game in 9th edition? Look forward to hearing your thoughts as always down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons are what allows me to keep all these videos coming quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.